What kind of society crafts a death so cruel that the victim's screams become a public spectacle? In ancient Greece, cruelty was not a mere outburst of chaos. It was an art form, meticulously engineered to terrify, control, and captivate. Among the most chilling creations was the brazen bull, a bronze monstrosity that turned execution into grotesque theater. Picture a hollow bull, cast in gleaming metal, large enough to encase a human. Its purpose? To roast the condemned alive. Their agonized cries transformed into the eerie bellows of a beast. This was no simple killing. It was a performance of power, designed to sear fear into the hearts of onlookers in ancient Sicily, a Greek colony under the iron grip of the tyrant Phalaris. The brazen bull, sometimes called the Sicilian bull, was the brainchild of Perillus of Athens, an artisan whose twisted ingenuity promised a humane execution. Humane, that is, by the standards of a tyrant. Perillus crafted the bull with a hollow chamber and a side door to trap the condemned inside. Beneath, a fire would rage, heating the bronze until it glowed, slowly cooking the victim. Yet the true horror lay in its design. A network of acoustic pipes turned screams into bull-like roars, amplifying the spectacle for the gathered crowd. When Perillus presented his creation to Phalaris, the tyrant saw its potential, not just for death, but for domination. In a cruel twist of fate, Phalaris tested the bull on its creator. Perillus was locked inside, his screams the first to echo as the bronze glowed red-hot. Dragged out, barely alive, he was hurled off a cliff, a poetic end to a man who engineered agony. Whether the tale is embellished or not, the brazen bull remains a haunting symbol of punishment as performance, a warning to all who defied absolute authority. Though associated most famously with Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, then a Greek colony, this gruesome device was a product of Greek ingenuity. According to Diodorus Siculus, a 1st century BCE historian, the brazen bull was created by Perillus of Athens, who proposed it as a humane execution tool. His idea of humanity, however, reveals a chilling vision. Perillus designed the bull to be entirely hollow, with a side door for inserting the condemned. A fire was lit beneath the structure. As the bronze heated, the person inside would burn to death. To heighten the spectacle, a system of acoustic pipes was engineered so that the victim's screams were transformed into the bellowing of a bull. It was not just execution, it was theater, terror, and power fused into one instrument. Diodorus recounts that Phalaris, upon hearing the proposal, invited Perillus to demonstrate its effects. But in a dark twist of poetic justice, Perillus became its first victim. He was locked inside and subjected to his own creation's horror. Phalaris then dragged him out, barely alive, only to cast him off a cliff. This tale, whether exaggerated in detail or not, reflects something undeniably real: the role of punishment as performance in ancient society. The brazen bull was more than a tool of death. It was a message to the public, a warning, a spectacle, and a declaration of absolute authority. It stands as one of history's most infamous examples of engineered cruelty. Raphanadosis, radish torture for moral offenders. What happens when humiliation becomes a form of state-sanctioned pain? Among the lesser-known, yet deeply unsettling punishments in ancient Greece was a method known as raphanadosis, a form of morally charged corporal punishment involving the use of vegetables, reportedly inflicted on individuals who committed certain sexual or ethical offenses. Though difficult to imagine by modern standards, this penalty reveals how ancient justice could blend physical suffering with public humiliation. The practice is most famously referenced in the plays of Aristophanes, the Athenian comic playwright, renowned for his sharp satire. In The Clouds, 423 BCE, he refers to raphanidosis as a punishment for adultery. According to the depiction, the offender would have a large radish, raphanos in Greek, forcefully inserted into the rectal area, often in a public or performative setting. While Aristophanes was known for exaggeration, the casual mention of the act implies that the audience was already familiar with the reference. Later ancient commentators, known as scholiasts, supported the idea that raphanidosis may have been more than metaphor, a real, if rare, form of punishment in Athens, possibly enforced against those who violated deeply held social norms. The punishment served a dual purpose, delivering not only physical pain, but also lasting public disgrace. In a culture like Athens, where reputation and self-restraint, sophrosyne, were core virtues, such an act could socially ruin a person more effectively than exile or execution. Raphanidosis stands as a disturbing reminder that in ancient Athens, justice could be designed to break not just the body, but the identity and dignity of the offender. Hemlock poisoning, Athens' method of execution. What kind of democracy chooses to kill its wisest citizen, and does so with calculated calm? No method of ancient Greek execution is more historically resonant or philosophically charged than hemlock poisoning, most famously used in the 399 BCE execution of the philosopher Socrates, known as Socrates in classical Greek. This state-sanctioned death, carried out in democratic Athens, was not only a punishment, but a ritual, a sober, controlled end, framed by law and civic order. In Athenian judicial procedure, when a citizen was condemned to death, the standard method of execution was ingestion of a fatal draught made from the Conium maculatum plant, commonly known as hemlock. Unlike other tortures or mutilations practiced across the Greek world, this method was framed as humane, though its effects were anything but painless. Hemlock is a neurotoxin. It gradually causes paralysis, beginning at the feet and moving upward, while the mind remains conscious. Eventually, the diaphragm ceases to function, leading to suffocation. Death could take an hour or more, depending on the dose and the person's constitution. Plato's Phaedo offers the most vivid account of Socrates' final moments. According to Plato, after calmly discussing the soul and the afterlife with his followers, Socrates drank the hemlock himself, as required by Athenian law. His last words were directed to his friend Crito. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See to it. And don't forget." A symbolic statement, some believe, expressing gratitude for a cure, in this case, death as a release from mortal suffering. Socrates had been convicted on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. While scholars debate whether this was a genuine threat or a political scapegoating, the method of execution was clear and codified. The Athenian polis saw itself not as a tyrant's tool, but as a legal body dispensing lawful justice, even when that justice meant ending the life of its greatest philosophical mind. Unlike executions designed to shame or terrify, hemlock was part of a judicial system that emphasized due process. Yet its quiet horror lay precisely in its civility. There were no flames, no blades, only a cup, a courtroom, and a slow descent into stillness. Blinding as punishment, permanent mutilation for justice. In the ancient Greek world, blinding was not merely a form of vengeance, it was a deliberate, judicially or politically sanctioned punishment. It rendered a person not only physically disabled, but socially diminished, stripping them of agency and status in a society that prized both visual participation in civic life and military service. Though less standardized than methods like hemlock poisoning, blinding was employed in various Greek city-states, particularly in cases of treason, political betrayal, or sacrilege. It was an irreversible act, meant to ensure the offender would never again lead, witness, or influence public life. The punishment was often carried out using hot irons or sharp implements, gouging or searing the eyes until permanent damage was achieved. In some cases, blindness may have been partial, inflicted to disfigure more than disable, especially when used to shame rather than incapacitate. Blinding in ancient Greece was both punishment and symbolism used to permanently remove one's place in civic and moral life. It marked the offender not just with pain, but with lasting exclusion from the visual and political order of the polis. Stoning, collective execution in Greek justice. Among the most ancient forms of execution, stoning, or lithobolia in Greek, was used in certain Greek polis as a form of collective punishment, where justice was not handed down by a single executioner, but rather by the hands of the citizenry themselves. Brutal by its very nature, stoning turned punishment into a public act of consensus, a shared condemnation, physically enacted by the very society the offender had wronged. While stoning was more famously codified in Near Eastern legal systems, such as those of ancient Israel, it was also practiced in the Greek world, particularly in response to crimes that violated sacred trust, such as blasphemy, sacrilege, or heinous treason. Unlike the individualized trial and execution methods of classical Athens, stoning was designed to be visible, communal, and final. The legal basis for stoning appears in various city-state laws, though not always preserved in full detail. One example comes from Draco's early Athenian code of the 7th century BCE, a notoriously harsh set of laws, where, as Aristotle later wrote, death was prescribed for almost every offense. While not all crimes resulted in stoning, the method was associated with crimes against the gods or the polis itself, such as defiling sacred spaces or betraying one's fellow citizens. Execution by stoning was not swift. The condemned would be dragged to a public place, often outside the city walls or at a designated execution ground. There, citizens would throw stones until the person was dead. The slow, painful death delivered not only physical torment, but the collective judgment of the community. To be stoned was to be erased not just from life, but from belonging. Importantly, stoning was more than just execution. It was ritual purification. The community cleansed itself by physically removing the source of contamination. In some cases, the corpse was denied burial within the city, a further mark of disgrace. Starvation in the pit, a death without escape. What punishment is more final than death? One that drags it out in silence and in darkness. Among the most chilling methods of execution in ancient Greece was starvation in the pit, a punishment designed not merely to kill, but to do so through isolation, deprivation, and slow descent into madness. It was known in Athens as the barathron, varathron, a deep chasm or rocky pit located just outside the city, used to dispose of those condemned for especially grievous offenses. The barathron was more than a geographical feature. It was a symbol of complete civic rejection, a place where traitors, murderers, and enemies of the state were hurled to die out of sight, out of mind, and out of reach. While in some cases, victims may have been thrown to their death instantly, historical sources indicate that starvation and abandonment were also used, particularly for politically sensitive figures. Unlike stoning, which invited the crowd, or hemlock, which involved the courts, the pit was a sentence of silence. Once cast into its rocky maw, the condemned was left to perish over days, alone, without food or water, stripped of dignity and voice. It was the physical manifestation of civic excommunication. Athenian sources, including the Scholia, Ancient commentaries on speeches by orators like Demosthenes refer to the Barathron as the execution ground for traitors, prodotes, and those who attempted coups or betrayed military secrets. In some accounts, the body was discarded there post-mortem. In others, the individual was left alive to die in the pit. In both, the result was the same: oblivion through abandonment. As the 5th century BCE historian Thucydides observed in his History of the Peloponnesian War, it is the nature of man to remember the honorable and to forget the shameful. The Barathron ensured that the condemned were not remembered at all. In ancient Greece, justice could be swift, symbolic, or excruciating, but always intentional. These punishments were not mere brutality. They reflected a society wrestling with law, honor, and the boundaries of civic control. Even in democracy, cruelty found order. History demands reflection. How far can civilization go to preserve itself before becoming what it fears? Comment below. Can justice remain just when it requires suffering? As Heraclitus once said, justice will overtake fabricators of lies and false witnesses.